I will now introduce Gabriel Motzkin, the director of the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. Professor Motzkin is an emeritus of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, where he held the Ahad Ha'am chair in philosophy and was also a member of the Department of History and German Literature. He has served as the Dean of Faculty of the Humanities and the Director of the Franz Rosenzweig Center for German Jewish Literature and Cultural History. Professor Motzkin has been a fellow at the Siemens Foundation, the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences, Clare Hall at the University of Cambridge, the Max Planck Institute for the History and for the History of Science, the Einstein Forum, the Wiener Institute at the Tel Aviv University, the Max Planck Institute for History, the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, and the Zentrum für Interdisziplinäre Forschung at Bielefeld. He has been a visiting professor at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, the University of Gießen, the University of Amsterdam, the University of Constance, and the Cardozo School of Law at Yeshiva University. Please, Gabi.
I can't believe that, but I won't go into it. All right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to meander a bit and ask some questions, and it's a fairly long talk, and the thing to do is to try to figure out what the questions are, because I have no answers. And I'm talking about curricula. I'm really talking about curricular design and what are the factors that go into them. So all proposed curricula designs face two issues. One, is there a common core of knowledge that all people or all students should know? Two, is this common core a question of common methods or common contents? Normally, if we think of a common core of knowledge, we imagine contents rather than methods. That is because even though by definition methods are more precise, we actually have vaguer ideas about methods than about contents. Perhaps that is because of the way we humans get around in the world, in which we are more interested in our goals and objectives than in how we get there. Unless we obscure the distinction between contents and methods, such in such an expression as democratic procedures, when we talk of what we want all people to know, we want them all to know, e.g. the Bible or Dante or Goethe or calculus. That is because we are unclear about whether methods are an issue of the philosophy of science or just a compendium of how-to procedures such as learning a foreign language. Thus, curricula for general education rarely include courses in mathematics and or statistics because these are not viewed as being enriching. Moreover, general education courses about science are usually cast as popularizations of the content of science and rarely engage questions of practical scientific methodology. So the first question we need to ask is whether there is any consensus about a common content of knowledge. This common content can be divided, in one of many ways, into knowledge of one's own culture and knowledge about other cultures. In all countries in the world, there's a balance between the universal and the particular, between what the authorities think one should know about one's own country and literature and what the authorities think one should know about the world as a whole, about the history and literature of other countries. Each country has an evident notion of the knowledge of its own country, however that knowledge be conceived. Where there is a lack of consensus is in the knowledge of other countries, of other cultures. That is because one culture views another culture through its own lenses, so it may emphasize different elements of the other culture than those that are actually valued highly by that other culture. It may be assumed, for example, that if a native culture is philosophical, or it is historical, or it is literary, the native culture will view the other cultures via its own proclivity. A problem arises when one country is more philosophical, but the other country is more literary. The question is then, does one learn the philosophy or the literature of the other country? One can perceive that there has often occurred a movement from interpreting other countries in one's own terms to accepting what are perceived as the prime strength of the foreign culture. Thus, here's an example. France introduced into its high schools a serious study of German philosophy after 1870. You can figure out why. Although the French system itself did not take French philosophy as seriously as it took French literature. However, it should also be pointed out that there is no consensus about a common universal culture. In this respect, what is conceived as a general international culture is different from country to country. Following the above, however, this variation is not a consequence of the variation between cultures, but rather a consequence of how a country perceives other countries and how that keeps changing. These considerations presume that a key issue for basic education that an introductory curriculum at the university at the university level should address is that of the relation between the global and the local. In the past, it was assumed that what is global is the past and what is local is the present. We all shared common traditions and lived in nation states with distinct languages and cultures. Thus, what was taught were classical languages and history, everybody was supposed to know this, as the fields that go beyond the local. At present, we live in a world with reversed assumptions. Without knowing how or why it has occurred, we think that our present is global and international, and our past was local. Thus, what we seek to impart to all are computer and communicative skills, while we view history and literature as being primarily spheres of local identity. Much can and should be said about why this has occurred or how, but what it means for university teaching is a change in the way things are taught. History and literature were taught in two frameworks: individual study and supervised review, and discussion in the presence of a single teacher. In some situations, classroom discussion was added as an important variation, but this relatively expensive addition, classroom discussion costs a lot of money, could only occur where it could be funded and where students could be assumed to be open to learn a culture of discussion. By definition, contemporary communicative skills cannot be taught on an individual level. Moreover, it is not clear that an authority relationship, such as the traditional one between teacher and student, can encourage the development of such communicative skills. To that should also be added that computer homework is unlike traditional homework, or rather it is more like the old classes in either penmanship or learning a language. In other words, you have to learn by doing. So contemporary learning privileges doing, and it also essentially requires group discussion. That explains why most online courses fail. They require the student to replicate knowledge as if she were a traditional student. The question then arises of what contents are best taught through cooperative discussions. Clearly, debate and dialogue benefit from this kind of format. That may well mean that the study of rhetoric, which has been neglected in the modern university because of its lack of relevance to the university context of acquiring knowledge, may be, with some alterations, about to experience renewed favor, since the essence of any cooperative situation is persuasion. Moreover, cooperative discussions often assumed some cultural homogeneity among the participants. This assumption is both weakened and strengthened by contemporary computer technology. On the one hand, an internet course brings together people from different cultures. On the other hand, courses on the internet are part of a trend towards greater cultural homogeneity throughout the world. Of course, that is true for all educational programs. They homogenize students by making them acquire a common product. Indeed, one unsolved issue of any educational system is that of preserving the individual character of participants in the collective setting of a common education. The first question one needs to ask is, in designing an educational program, is what is the purpose of the program? The humanities, for example, have generally been justified on two different grounds. The first is to provide a general cultural education for either the elites or for everyone. The second is to foster critical thought, i.e., adults should be critical with respect to any proposition, whether in politics or in business, and that is why they need to learn how to read texts. You see that the assumption here is that learning how to read will translate into learning how to manage life. The underlying issue, however, is whether these assumptions are correct. First, what is the benefit of a general cultural education? Secondly, is it really the optimal situation for a society that most of its members be critics? General education was originally conceived as a form of training for elites. In the United States, which had no centralized secondary education, General education meant the introductory courses in college, as I mentioned, art history at Princeton or world civ at Columbia. These were generally large lecture courses in which the basis of knowledge, which were often lacking in the American high school curriculum, were imparted to whom? They were imparted to that small minority of students who were being taught at these elite universities. In other words, general education was designed for the future political and economic rulers of the country. In contrast, normal high schools often emphasized American history, i.e., what people needed to know in order to become functioning citizens of the United States. In some ways, this model is like that was proposed to me by Yehuda Elkanah, in which general education would be moved to graduate school, since only advanced researchers are supposed to really need a general education. That's what he said to me. The difference is that Elkanah was questioning the point in the educational sequence in which general education is imparted, whereas originally general education was stratified with the supposedly more advanced social classes enjoying its fruits. General education was a form of educational class differentiation. At some point, people grew uneasy with this kind of elitism and sought to find in general education a source of legitimacy for a democratic political order. This uneasy nexus was reflected in the title of the 1946 Harvard report entitled General Education in a Free Society. Here the idea was that general education has a social role which is the opposite of that of distinguishing a ruling elite, but is rather that of training citizens who can contribute to the political and social well-being of their country. The idea was that a democracy needs an educated citizenry. Instead of democracy needing an educated elite, general education would make it possible for all citizens to participate judiciously in the political process. Yet, when it came to designing the curriculum, the scheme that this report adopted envisioned basic courses that would integrate across fields, but these courses would be divided, as you all know, according to three categories: natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities. This division is as artificial as any division, and moreover, it had the effect of strengthening, and I remember this, the prejudice of most students against the natural sciences, because of the perceived difficulty of learning to use a mathematical mode of expression. However, even the division into humanities and social sciences was questionable. An argument could be made that the humanities embodied mankind's past traditions, whereas the social sciences were presumably interested in the contemporary world. However, certain social sciences, things that are in the Faculty of Social Sciences, such as political philosophy or sociological theory, had more in common with the text-based humanities, while history has sometimes been assigned to the social sciences rather than to the humanities. And philosophy often seems to have more in common with mathematics than it does with the philological humanities. In other words, any organization of knowledge creates categories that are partially true and partially false. Such knowledge organization then has consequences for the development of knowledge and also for the organization of society, since people are often tracked according to what they have studied. The determining issue for forming an elite is that of the kind of education it receives and how that education is different from that of other citizens. In all countries, here's an example, lawyers constitute a large segment of the elite. However, their education is very different in different countries. In the English-speaking countries, lawyers pursue another kind of education first, one usually in the humanities or the social sciences, and only then do they study law. The alleged benefit is that lawyers trained in this way then have a broad-based general education. In Israel, as in continental Europe, lawyers study law directly upon finishing their high school qualification. The assumption in this kind of system is that the lawyers have already received a wide general education during their secondary education, an assumption which has grown quite tenuous as more people have been completing a secondary qualification. Thus, lawyers in these countries, another controversial statement, are generally less well educated than in the English-speaking countries. On the other hand, in the English-speaking countries, it was not clear until recently whether or not law should at all be treated as an academic discipline. In the United States, there existed the increasingly rare option of studying law by being articled with a qualified lawyer. You just have to sign up for 5 years and be registered, and you can then take the bar, thus avoiding the need to go to law school at all. In the United Kingdom, legal training is accomplished by attending the Inns of Court, which are not viewed as academic institutions. If we pursue this example, what kind of general education would a society wish to provide to lawyers? We clearly no longer think that lawyers need to study classical languages. Much as we may not like to admit it, we want the attorneys of the future to have a basic literacy in the natural sciences, whether in biology or in physics, since so much of their professional time will be taken up with developments in these fields. However, in today's world, what has really replaced the classical languages are the social sciences, and especially economics. In those countries in which people have a more specialized preparatory general education, they will have been trained in the social sciences. This development has both good and bad sides. On the one hand, it exposes such prospective lawyers to a high level of methodological thinking. On the other hand, such an education may dampen their imagination more than it may stimulate it. Moreover, writing and critical skills will not be furthered by a social science education. This example has proved useful, for it shows us what we want: scientific literacy, writing skills, critical judgment, and some knowledge about society. It should be obvious that the specific method for imparting each of these skills is quite different. Moreover, each of these skills is itself not as precise in its formulation as some of the other skills. Scientific literacy and knowledge about its society, such as in economics, can still be imparted by large lecture courses. There is no way that either writing skills or critical judgment can be taught by large lecture courses. This consideration raises the second issue which a general education-based curriculum confronts: the question of the meaning and purpose of education in relation to criticism, to the development of critical thinking capabilities. In one way, this question is newer than the question of the content of a general education. In another way, the idea of critique is demonstrably older than that of a common knowledge shared by elites. The point is that training for criticism was originally not housed in universities. The reason is that until at least the late 18th century, university education everywhere was primarily training for either the religious elites or for the legal and medical professions. The universities did not provide any place for the largely secular culture that they have pervaded in the last 2 centuries. However, the idea of critique was intimately bound up with the development of secular culture, a culture that can be traced first to the turn to the Greek classics in the 15th century, Erasmus, and then to the querelle des anciens modernes in late 17th century France. Indeed, it could be argued that critique was indirectly derived even from the university tradition of scholastic disputation, with its emphasis on logical argument and proof. However, the fundamental idea that critique could be emancipatory required development outside the institutions of society, the rise of a small elite of largely independent scholars. Only after the French Revolution was the idea domesticated inside universities that the purpose of a university is to proffer an alternative culture. During the Restoration, student revolts and faculty protests were the menu du jour in both France and Germany. The university had become an alternative political space in a political context of counter-revolutionary regimes. This development could not be foreseen in the 18th century. However, it also marked another important development, namely the migration of the idea of social critique from urban space into the academic context. This development also had consequences for research and scholarship. Henceforth, the question for scholarship was whether or not it was to be politically or socially subversive. It could be argued that a political system gains stability by isolating critique within universities. You students, you think whatever you want over there. On the other hand, revolutionary movements, by being concentrated in universities, acquire the exponential energy of being surrounded by a like-minded group. The reason that revolutions then do not originate in universities is that most people's time in university is limited. The great problem for any student-led rebellious movement is that of continuity. Critique, however, was significant in another way. Until the early 19th century, professorial positions were awarded with little relevance to research. The idea that research is essential for academic promotion matured in Germany in the early 19th century. The Prussian state could not afford to maintain both teaching universities and research academies, and so they hit upon the originally budget-saving idea of combining both ideas in the same institution. This happened at the same time as student movements were importing the idea of social critique into the universities. Both things happened at the same time. My argument is that the politically motivated idea of critique was transformed into the idea of academic self-renewal through tearing down the old and consequently designing new paradigms for the advancement of thought and knowledge. There is a direct relation between the French Revolution and the idea of career advancement based on original research. That meant that that research could henceforward only be carried out by people with critical minds. Inside the university, the interplay between critique and research and social and political critique has been a leitmotif of the last 2 centuries. The question is, however, this: how can we teach critique? The temptation is to assert that we teach dogma and leave critique to the rebellion against dogma that will follow. It'll happen on its own. We, however, believe that we can inculcate subversion even vis-a-vis ourselves. Promoting dissent, however, on any other theory than that dissent is always there cannot be achieved through any form of lecture courses. Dissent and critical discourse require dialogue. In the dialogue, in a virtual or in a physical classroom, the key role is played by the listeners who are learning the skill of independent, creative listening. Moreover, the question arises of whether we can isolate intellectual critique from political critique. German academics were historically fond of asserting their own unpolitical nature, even while they did not fear to be critical in their own fields of research. At the other extreme, the fear is that politics can distort research in such a way as to hinder the creative originality which we view as the ultimate purpose of education. There is an even more basic problem here. Education imparts knowledge. It strengthens skills and improves the sharpness of minds. The question arises of whether we can educate people, forgive me, to wisdom. Now, there are 2 opposing views on this. On the one hand, there are those that who argue that wisdom can only be acquired through experience, i.e. that wisdom cannot be taught. Behind this argument is the idea that wisdom is always particular and never general. And still excavating further, the implication is that wisdom cannot be communicated. If wisdom could be communicated, then it could also be taught. If wisdom were general, then it could also be abstracted. In that case, at some point, wisdom might be as detached from ordinary experience as is our research into particle physics. The opposing view was more popular before the Enlightenment. History, for example, before the Enlightenment, was considered to be a subject that could be taught through examples of great men who would then prove models for future leaders. There was no distinction between a scientific education and education for conduct. In that sense, someone could read novels with the idea of learning how to comport herself in erotic or emotional situations. That's why people read novels, to find out how to behave. Flaubert parodies that. That's what you did. We must be able to say that we seek to educate people so that they can acquire wisdom, which means whether or not we wish to determine the contents of wisdom, we do think there are right ways and wrong ways by which wisdom may be acquired or not. The reason I'm raising this issue here is that there's some kind of connection between criticism or critique and wisdom. Clearly, critique can be a destructive tool when wielded by stupid people. In the right hands, however, critique is one of the essential tools by which wisdom can be acquired. The idea is that education has a purpose that is not only research-oriented. It's very important. However, that other from research is vague. Do we mean the political sphere, civil society, high culture, aesthetics, writing poetry, or seeking religious revelation? It does, however, follow that scientific research is not a goal in itself. It seeks to promote our understanding of the world. The assumption is here that knowledge can lead to wisdom. That's what promoting understanding of the world as I understand it means. This assumption that knowledge can lead to wisdom has often been refuted in the course of events. Knowledge has often led to foolishness. Moreover, without critique, knowledge is prone to lead to foolishness. Yet we do not teach wisdom. Our educational goal is competence. That's what we really train people for. When we teach general education, we think that we are potentially producing more competent students. Yet we all know that competence and wisdom are divergent goals. Knowledge can lead in either direction. That does not mean that competence and wisdom contradict each other, but it is true that we often mistake competence for wisdom. That reveals the essential role of critique. We may be able to be competent without being wise, but we cannot be wise unless we employ critical reflection. We have answered the question about the necessity of inculcating critical abilities, but we have not answered the question about the necessity of a general education. We seem to be sure about the methods we want people to know, but we are less certain about the contents we want people to know. In Israel, we teach all Jewish students Bible, Talmud, and Hebrew literature, high school curriculum. In that way, we foster national identity. If, however, national identity is really declining throughout the world, then teaching these contents is of limited relevance. Yet, on the other hand, with what would we replace them? A course on German history may be useful for Germans, but it is of limited use for Israelis. So are we then to conclude that there's no history that we want all people to know, or that it does not matter which history we teach, since historical methods can be taught by teaching arbitrarily different histories? This problem could be resolved by teaching the transnational subjects, which are neither literature nor history, but rather philosophy and economics. Obviously, something would be lost in such a transition. Moreover, we would need to have a well-thought-out rationale for why we want everybody to know philosophy. On the other hand, unless there exist universal subjects, then the claim that there is a general education that everybody should have will be vitiated. General education will turn into a congeries of contents that will be differently assembled by each individual. Something like that is already happening. The question will then arise of the basis for communication. Some content that people deploy has already escaped the educational framework. If you know who was Marilyn Monroe, and I know who was Marilyn Monroe, then we can have a conversation about either sex or the movies, quite apart from our different cultures. That is because we have imbibed our world of associations from universal media, which provide us with the content of our communications. We don't talk to each other while quoting Virgil, which was common in most European countries from the 18th to the early 20th centuries. You know, people used to go to Iceland, and when they went to Iceland, of course, they didn't know Icelandic. This was in the 18th and early 19th century. They talked Latin because the priests in Iceland knew Latin. That was the universal method, and they all had a classical education in Iceland. I'm not talking about Germany or France. All right? We don't share a common literature. We certainly don't share a common history, but we certainly share a set of images in common, a set to which we refer to even when we talk with people far away. Moreover, here education will not help. I can read the Quran in a classroom, but I will never share the imaginative associations that Muslims brought up since childhood with the Quran have in common. It will not be a communicative reference for me. My conclusion is then the following. We agree that we wish to inculcate critical reflection. We also agree that we have to find a way of doing this that is both low cost and pedagogically effective, i.e. low cost discussion groups. However, we need to do two things. First, we need a conversation about a common content. Second, we need to solve the issue of low cost discussion groups, i.e. we need to design a cheap, high-end model of education that can be adopted by very different populations. I have some ideas about this, but that's going to be another talk. Thank you.